been a few moments. So welcome to the Ability Center's webinar on virtual learning for students with disabilities under IDEA and ADA. And before we get started, I'd like to review some accommodations that we have available. I'd like to introduce our interpreters, Laura and Terry. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. Closed captioning is available. Thank you to Jody. So thank you, Jody. And the chat box is available for questions at any time, but we will be reading them out loud at the end of the presentation, so we'll be able to answer those questions at the end. And then I'd also like to remind everyone that this is set up webinar style, so attendees can only see the speaker, moderators, and interpreters. All viewers are muted and their video is off. My name is Leah, and I am the Youth Transition Coordinator in the Youth and Transition Department here at the Ability Center. And I am also with my coworker, Katie. And Katie, would you like to introduce yourself and get us started?
Sure. My name is Katie Hunt-Thomas. I'm the Disability Rights Attorney and Director of Advocacy here at the Ability Center. And our Youth Services program has asked me to moderate you. I know that as we return back to school, Youth Services has been getting a lot of questions about the rights of students with disabilities in this time of COVID-19, where we might be returning to school virtually or partially virtually, and what the rights that parents have for their kids during this time, and how they can apply those and ensure that their kids are being served appropriately. So to answer that, we have invited a couple of panelists to be here today to answer some questions. So if the two of you would want to introduce yourselves and give a little bit of information about where you work, who you are, and your professional background. Jennifer, would you want to go first?
Sure. I am Jennifer Kirby. I am the Managing Advocate and Consultant at Bright Horizons Advocacy and Consulting. We are a nonprofit agency and we specialize in education advocacy. So this is right up our alley. It's about 90% of what we do. But we also help out with people who need help applying for SSI and people who need help applying for Board of DD services and lots of things like that. But really our primary focus is school services, for which we work with kiddos from 3 all the way up through graduation and transitioning on into college services. And I have been doing education-related advocacy for the last 25 years. Yes, I'm old. But I have been around for quite a while. My background originally, and sometimes people joke about this, originally I started out as a librarian. But since then, I've added other things to my background. I do have an intervention certificate in autism spectrum disorders from Bowling Green State. And I also did go to law school for a year. So I'm not an advocate of going to law school and working full time, but I did go to law school for a year.
Thanks. It was interesting to hear a little bit more about your background. I don't think I knew that. Yeah. Taylor, do you want to go next?
So my name is Taylor Burns, and I'm a staff attorney with Advocates for Basic Legal Equality, or ABLE. ABLE is a nonprofit regional law firm providing legal assistance in civil matters to help individuals with low income, and we serve 32 counties in Western Ohio. Personally, I attended the Ohio State University for undergrad, and then I went to law school at the University of Miami. I'm born and raised in Toledo, though, and I've been with ABLE for about 3.5 years. My time there is split between education work and housing and economic development work. And my work specifically focuses on serving mental health consumers, although we have attorneys who serve individuals in other areas like public benefits, family law, different things like that.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing. First question. Can you tell us what Fape, Free Appropriate Public education means, and also talk about the responsibilities schools have under the IDEA?
Yeah, so I can take this first one. So special education is a field where we love our acronyms and initialisms. Fape, like Leah said, is a free, appropriate public education, and it's the basic guarantee of the IDEA. And IDEA stands for Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It's the federal law that gives us the rules for how schools must educate students with disabilities. So there's a few key words there, right? There's free education, meaning all services must be provided to students with disabilities at no cost. There's public education, right? So this applies to public schools and charter or community schools, but not to private schools. And then there's the word appropriate, and this is where we see the most conflicts as to whether a school has provided FAPE to a specific child. And really, what is appropriate? It is an educational program that's reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress in light of the child's circumstances. So we have this whole legal definition, but what does that mean for your child, right? FAPE is the specialized education and related services required to meet their unique needs. Parents can look at Section 7 of the IEP to see what the IEP team thinks is necessary to allow them to access FAPE. I just want to note that neither the U.S. Department of Education nor the Ohio Department of Education has waived the requirement to provide FAPE during the COVID-19 pandemic in the spring or during the upcoming school year. So I don't know, Jennifer, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I was going to add to that. It's really important to understand that the federal law did not go away because of COVID. All that the federal government has said is that there may be some flexibility in how things look. So your child's IEP may not look exactly the same, but the requirements to accommodate your child and serve your child so that they do receive an education, as Taylor said, reasonably calculated to progress, remain the same. So what we're truly discovering as we move from the whole spring closure where everybody was just sort of hoping we would all get past this to this becoming more of a lifestyle is that we're really going to have to emphasize that individual portion of the IEP. Not that it hasn't always been supposed to be individual before, and Taylor, I'm sure you'll agree with that. There are some standard things that we would see a lot of kids get, and now we're needing to look at how can we really individualize, because we have kiddos that do really well online. We have kids that don't do as well online. We have kids that would love to go to school during one of the hybrid sessions, but also have health concerns. So to me, this is going to be the big year of individualizing the individualized education plan, because I really think we're going to have to look at what schools are offering and make sure that they're meeting those basic guidelines of FAPE. But then within each child's IEP, we're going to have to look at it really individually and say, okay, how can we make the infrastructures that the school has work for this kiddo?
Thank you. And the next question we had gets to a distinction that I think a lot of parents maybe don't know or have some difficulty understanding. So we know that the IDEA requires FAPE, but there are some other laws that apply as well. So would you guys be able to talk a little bit about how the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act affect students, and how is that different from the IDEA?
Sure. Do you want me to start off on that one, Taylor, and then you can piggyback?
Yeah.
Okay. The ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that applies not only to public schools, but to private schools as well. And what that says is that because a private school and a public school are both considered places of public accommodation, and public schools are also considered government entities. So public schools fall under the ADA in two ways. Private schools fall under them because they're considered places of public accommodation. And what that means is that private schools still have to provide accommodations. They don't necessarily have to provide modifications to instruction and special education at the level that we would see at a public school or a charter school. And Katie mentioned this earlier, but just to emphasize, charter and community schools are public schools. They are not private schools. Sometimes they like to pretend that they are to fool parents out there and, oh, we don't have to do that. We're a little tiny special school. No, they're a public school. So just to get that out of the way. But private schools are covered under the ADA, which means they do need to provide reasonable accommodations. So for our students, that can mean things like extra time. It can mean things like assistive technology, speech to text, text to speech, blowing things up if your child has a visual impairment, allowing them to take frequent breaks, allowing them to use sensory materials, of course, anything like a sign language interpreter and things like that. But there isn't necessarily the requirement that they provide the specialized instruction that you would see from an intervention specialist in a public school. And here in Ohio, it gets a little bit blurry because we have a lot of kids on scholarship that go to our private schools, and there's a lot of parents who think, well, if I'm on a scholarship with my child's IEP, I have all those same rights. And the way our scholarship law is written is to specifically say that the private school implementing the scholarship does not actually have to provide Fape. So it's allowing the parent to select a private school option, but it doesn't have near the teeth that somebody like Taylor and I and our fellow staff members would be able to use to help parents as we would when kiddos are in public schools. Taylor, do you want to expand some more?
So I just want to get down really to, I get a lot of questions about what's the difference between an IEP and a 504 plan. And what the eligibility for both of those things is a little bit different. But really what is different is the type of educational benefit required. So as we talked about, the IDEA focuses on student progress in relation to their own potential, whereas 504 requires access to services, access that's as effective as non-disabled peers. So the question when we're looking at whether a 504 plan is sufficient is whether the child could access the work. So during the school building closure, did the school accommodate a child with a visual impairment who could not participate in certain types of virtual learning experiences? I do want to emphasize that just like the IDEA, the requirements of Section 504 and the ADA have not been waived during the COVID-19 pandemic. So any services or accommodations listed in a student's 504 plan should have been provided during the spring building closure and should continue into this fall. But again, like Jennifer described for the IDEA and IEPs, these services could look much different. So just as an example, so if you have a child who has an accommodation that's preferential seating because they struggle with attention, that's probably not applicable during virtual learning, right? When they're sitting alone in front of a computer. But they may need some other type of accommodation to keep their attention during the virtual learning, maybe shortened lessons or something else. So the accommodations in the 504 plan should still be there, but if it needs to look a little bit different because of the learning environment, then the parents in the 504 team should work with the school to figure out what those accommodations can look like in a different learning environment.
And a big thing to know about 504, and those of you who have watched Bright Horizons on Facebook in the past. This is one of the things that we like to drive home quite a lot. There's a lot of people who think a 504 is not as good as an IEP. It's just as legal. It really, truly is. It's, as Taylor said, it serves a different purpose. A 504 is to accommodate and level the playing field. So there's a way wider swath of kids that are eligible for under 504 than are eligible under IEP. So it's not that an IEP is better, it's just different. And the accommodations that would apply to your child on a 504 would continue to apply to them as they move into the college level, and some of them may apply as they go into the world of work and are looking for employment, because they would fall under the employment portions of the ADA. So that's probably Bright Horizons' favorite myth to bust is, oh, a 504 isn't as good as an IEP. So just wanted to get that in there.
I thought that's really great information, and you both explained that really well. So thank you.
Thank you, yeah. So there have and will be many challenges with online learning, especially for those students with a disability. A key component of special education is the IEP, which you guys started talking about. Can you guys discuss how school districts should adjust their procedures, programs, and services to comply with each student's IEP during these difficult times? As well as, is there anything in particular that parents should ask for as part of their child's IEP?
I can start this one. So the IEP is the document that says how a school is going to provide Fape to a child and how progress will be measured at its most basic. And during the spring building closure, we had guidance from the Ohio Department of Education that said schools need to make a good faith effort to provide what's stated in the IEP. And we know many IEPs were not updated to reflect the sudden virtual learning environment. But now we're in a different situation, right, as we move into this new school year. And schools have had time, although they may have wanted more, to adjust to this new world that we found ourselves in. So for this school year, the IEP team or 504 team should meet and update IEPs to describe what a student's learning will look like in multiple learning environments. That includes your traditional face-to-face, your blended learning, or your virtual learning. Because even if a school starts the year with all virtual learning, they may end the year in all in person, and you really want the IEP to address what the child's learning is going to look like and what their services will look like in each environment. So if the school does not reach out to schedule an IEP meeting, parents can and should reach out to schedule that meeting. We usually recommend making that request in writing, keeping a copy for yourself. An email is enough though, right? Because that will then be in your sent box. We also recommend giving the school a few times when the parent's available. And these meetings may be conducted virtually or in person if health and safety guidelines can be followed. So let the school know your preference. And then at that meeting, parents will request any types of services that they think are necessary to allow their child to make progress throughout the school year, whether it's in the virtual learning environment, blended, or in person. And as Jennifer really emphasized earlier, when we're talking about making changes to an IEP, remember that the services and instruction in an IEP must be individualized to meet a child's unique needs. The school's response should never be, well, that's what we're providing everyone right now. And I also want to emphasize that parents should not agree to lesser services or what they would consider a lesser IEP just because learning is remote, right? The standard for Fape, as we talked about, has not changed. So students with disabilities are not entitled to less. And then Jennifer, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
I would just second everything that you've said, and I think a really important thing for parents to look at, and this is what we're finding with our parents and doing lots of things individually, is you need to be really clear with your school district about what works for my child as far as, can they log on independently? Do they need help with that? Do they need help with following along with a lesson? It needs to be put back on the school. This is how much help my child needs. Because we have we're in the midst of doing a survey, and it's up on our Facebook page if any of you haven't gotten it, where we're trying to collect data from parents on the problems they're encountering so that we can take it back to the special ed directors. But what we're hearing a lot of is that parents have had a lot of burden on themselves over the spring closure. And as Taylor said, a lot of this was because we all really didn't know what was going on, and schools were trying their best. So even we as advocates were like, okay, we understand that this is a special circumstance, but now we're moving into a full year, and we really need to figure out how to plan and support for your kids with disabilities. So if you're doing a ton of work and you're the one sitting there having to keep your child focused, be very clear with your school that that's what's going on. If you don't know the accommodations that are available on your child's Chromebook, for example, be very clear about that. I have been really surprised with the survey coming back, because one of the questions we had is, do you know how to access things like speech to text and text to speech? And so many of our surveys came back of, oh, I didn't even know that was available on there. So, you know, be really upfront with your school district about, this is what my child needs to be successful, and this is the kind of help they need, because we all need to be working creatively to figure out how our kids can best work in the environment. For example, the issue of kiddos that have one-on-one paraprofessionals at school is one that we're finding more and more challenging, because school districts are trying to figure out, you know, can we, within health and safety guidelines, what would we do with that? And, you know, because parents want to help, but they don't necessarily want somebody in their home either. And at the same point, you have school staff going, well, I don't know if I'd be comfortable going to somebody's home. But then we have to look at things like, okay, what is the best way a paraprofessional could still work with a child and cue a child in the virtual setting, and maybe help them, guide them through a virtual lesson, so that we're still providing that extra support, so the parent isn't doing everything. But again, we're up against, there's not really a good way to physically bring a paraprofessional into people's homes. And I think that's something we're all going to be sorting out as advocates and families and school districts throughout the year. But your role as parents is to be straight up with your school district and say, this is the amount of help my child needs, because they're going to look at you and they're going to say, well, how much are you able to do? And you have every right as a parent to say, I can do this and this and this, but I cannot do everything. I need you to help me. They still have that legal responsibility to provide that support for you.
Thank you for sharing. That's a
And
lot of
I do want to just piggyback on that if I can. So something that we've heard from schools, and which is not true. So parent support can be a service that is included in the IEP. So like Jennifer said, parents can figure out what they can and cannot do to help their child. But if the parent needs support, whether that's the parent needs training on how to use that Chromebook or the Google Classrooms or whatever platform that's being used, parent training and support is something that can be included in the IEP. And really it is now, like Jennifer said, time to get really creative with IEP themes on how a child can be served virtually or in the blended learning environment.
Thank you. That's really good information to know when it comes to a child's IEP. Thanks for sharing.
And I know the two of you have talked a lot about customization right now, especially when there might be a combination of in-person and virtual learning, and no one can kind of anticipate what's happening next. Do you have any tips for parents? What steps can they take if they have concerns about how a school district is either implementing their child's IEP or a 504 plan, or is maybe refusing to address the circumstances that they think need to be addressed right now?
Do you want me to take that one, Jennifer? I can start, or
I can start, or you can start, either one.
I'll let you start.
All right. Well, first I would say it's very important to make sure that you're working with somebody at the district level, as far as you're in touch with a coordinator, depending on the size of your district, or your special education director, because this is not me downing special ed teachers at all, but especially in times like these, they don't have the most up-to-date what we're doing and what's going on, and so they're more likely to say, oh, we can't do this, just because they don't know. So you need to be going up the chain and asking your coordinator and asking your special ed director questions. And if you're getting pushback, then is the time to, get some assistance. I would also say, because we've run across this a couple of times so far, there's a lot of things that are going out from superintendents that are talking about, what we're doing for all students, and they're not really addressing kids with disabilities. And they get asked questions about kids with disabilities, and they'll say, oh, we're having our experts look into that, which is code for I'm handing this to my special ed director. So I would say, on behalf of special ed directors everywhere as well, we need to hold our superintendents accountable too, and say, this is a big segment of the population. When you talk about what we're doing for all students, we really want you as the superintendent to be informed on disability issues, and thinking about when you choose an online curriculum, when you choose to go back and forth between hybrid and online and in person, are you really thinking about all the kids? Because I've heard a lot of frustration from parents about letters coming out and memos coming out, and really those letters and memos are addressing the larger population as a whole. And I keep hearing from parents, this isn't really talking about our kids. And even though as advocates and attorneys, we can get frustrated with special ed directors at times. I mean, if we didn't, we wouldn't have jobs as advocates. But at the same time, we have to recognize that our kids are truly a district responsibility. They're not just one department's responsibility. So we can help our special ed directors get the resources they need to help our kids. If we say to the superintendents, our kids need to be just as front and center as worrying about what's happening to sports or what's happening to the band or etc.
So Jennifer just talked gave us a lot of really good information about moving forward. I want to talk just a little bit about, looking back. And there were many students who were left behind during the spring building closure. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the services that parents could request that children may be entitled to that will help catch them up. So I'm just going to briefly describe two of those. So first, there's compensatory education. And this has long been recognized by courts as like a legal remedy for students with disabilities. So compensatory education are educational services provided to make up for services when the school did not provide Fape. So this usually happens when the school district does not provide the services listed in the IEP, or even if the school did provide services, the services were not enough to meet the child's unique needs and allow meaningful progress. So again, compensatory education is meant to catch the child up to where they would have been expected to be if Fape was provided. Now there's a second type of service, this newly coined term, recovery services. And this is what educators are using to describe services children may need as a result of the school building closure. Guidance from the Ohio Department of Education describes these, and it almost suggests that they're like compensatory education, but they are specifically for a child's lack of progress on IEP goals or their schoolwork during the school building closure, regardless of the reason why they did not make progress. So these are services, again, similar to compensatory services, designed to close the gaps in a child's learning or progress towards IEP goals. Because these services are so new and we aren't quite sure what they're going to look like, how schools are going to interpret them, but it seems very likely that they're going to be very similar to compensatory education. And the key here when you are talking with your school about either of these services that your child may need is to only agree to the services you think are sufficient to make up for services not provided or progress not made. And these services can look like tutoring after school or on weekends, summer programs, additional counseling or therapy session, repayment of parent expenses. There's all kinds of different things that can make up these services. The key is what will work for that individual student. Parents can even ask for an outside provider to provide compensatory education, or for it to be provided in person. If a parent doesn't think the services worked well virtually and that's why their child is behind, it doesn't really make sense to have the compensatory education then virtual. And students aren't automatically entitled to these services. So documentation of what your child has received and the progress they have made or not made is really key in determining eligibility. So parents should be trying to track as much as possible what their child has received and whether or not that they have made progress. And if they believe their child's entitled to one of these services, they should request an IEP meeting.
And I think building on that, one of the things that we have been telling parents, and it came up specifically at the beginning of the spring when I had a couple of scholarship questions, because parents were asking, well, what can they be billing for during this time? And I said they should really only be billing for intervention services or related services if you're actually seeing the provider. So the rule of thumb that we've kind of given parents to look for is look at your IEP, say how many times a week, for example, your child was supposed to work with an intervention specialist or a related service provider. And again, the federal government didn't say the school had to meet it exactly, but as Taylor said earlier, they have to make a good faith effort. So if your child was supposed to see a speech therapist twice a week during this time, and last spring your child didn't see the speech therapist at all, and all they sent home was some exercises on paper, that would be a good thing to document for the school and say, look, I didn't get this. Or as Taylor just said so well, if they got the services but they didn't seem to be effective. So you're absolutely right, Taylor. Compensatory education is something that's really important. And piggybacking on that, and not to confuse anybody any further on the whole issue of compensatory and recovery services, there's also the question of extended school year. And what the government said when this all started is basically, if somebody would have been a candidate for extended school year before this started, they were still supposed to get extended school year this past summer, and the team was still supposed to discuss it. If you had a child who was not having problems but started having problems because of the spring closure, then they had said that will all be discussed by the IEP team in the fall. And correct me if I'm wrong, Taylor, that's then where we get into the whole idea of recovery services. So we have compensatory, which is if your district didn't provide a service. We have ESY, which there are particular groups of children that are eligible for ESY. And if your child should have gotten ESY this past summer and didn't, that is a problem that we need to look at, because ESY was still supposed to be happening during COVID. And I say that knowing that that was a challenge for some school districts, because a lot of ESY providers that they typically use were closed. So, but that still doesn't mean that your child isn't entitled to the services in some form or fashion. Just because summer was a problem, your child is still entitled to those supports and those services. And as Taylor said, it can look any number of different ways. So the key thing again is to go to your IEP team and say, my child missed this service. And if I were a parent, the way I would put it is, my child missed this service. This is where I think they have fallen behind because of the service, and how can we as a team address this?
Thanks for sharing. And kind of going along with, the IEPs and services, what are some tips and strategies that you can share with parents about advocating for their child when it comes to implementing these accommodations or modifications or services on their IEP with online learning?
So I just want to go back. So I think Jennifer and I both talked a little bit about tracking and documentation. And I want to explain a little bit more about what that means. Because I think some parents are like, okay, well, what am I tracking? What am I documenting? And parents should try to track or document as much as they can during, any period that the building is closed, virtual learning or blended learning. And each parent's ability to do this will be different. So, they should just do the best they can, but schools are far more responsive to data. So if parents can come into a meeting or have a request and back it up with data, that's usually very helpful. So just, I want to highlight two things parents should think about tracking. And the first is something Jennifer already talked about, and that's what instruction or services has your child been provided? And parents should know what services or instruction their child should be getting by looking at section 7 of the IEP. So that's got your specialized instruction and your related services in that section. Parents can make a simple chart or just write down, when their child was contacted, who provided the service, what was provided, and the number of minutes and when it was provided. So after tracking these, parents can ask themselves, did my child get everything that they were supposed to get in their IEP? The other thing parents may want to track is the progress made. And this can be a little bit trickier, I think, for parents. So every child's IEP has goals, and those are written in section 6. And this tells you the things that your child is working on individually. So you should look at the IEP. There should be some progress reports and other school records. You want to think about where was my child, or what is my child's starting point or baseline. If you don't have the records to figure this out, you can always ask the school for a copy of your child's school records. So figuring out then, you have your starting point. Look at what your child's supposed to be working on. For example, they may have a writing goal to use correct punctuation. And you should start looking at when your child's doing a writing assignment, are they using correct punctuation? And start kind of tracking how they're doing yourself in whatever way works for you. If you have difficulty tracking certain things, like let's say it's a behavior or reading out loud and you can't describe what's happening, feel free to take a video on your cell phone that you can share with the IEP team that will show how the child is doing. And so when you're looking at progress, parents should ask themselves, are they making progress towards the goal in their IEP, and are they making progress on their learning generally? And if the answer to either of those questions, so about the services or progress, is no, then parents should think about requesting an IEP meeting and potentially requesting compensatory education services, and definitely requesting some amendments to the IEP, because whatever is happening, especially if they're not making services or making progress, likely means they need additional or different services during, in the learning environment that they're in.
Absolutely. I would completely agree with all of that. And the other thing that I would suggest, and this goes back to accommodations, but it can also be useful for tracking progress and seeing as well. There's something that we always recommend when we're in IEPs and we have kids with goals, and it starts talking about the child will know this many sight words and this sort of thing. One of the things that I always ask, and it's ever more applicable today, is can the parents have a copy of what that magic list of sight words is? Because if you're an average parent and somebody starts talking to you about the adults or the fry list of sight words, you're like, what, where? So, any goal that your child has that refers to a specific thing like that, feel free to ask for those lists of sight words. Any accommodations that are listed on their IEP, like a number chart or a number line or any of that, you don't have to make that up at home. You don't have to go out to the learning store to buy it. Your school should be able to provide it to you, and then by giving your child those tools, you'll be able to see. And it's not like a fancy method of data tracking. Can my child use a number line? How is my child doing using their hundreds chart? Do they understand how it works? Do they not understand how it works? Can my child start a task within a certain amount of time? For our kids with behavior goals, you'll often see things that say, we'll start a given task without arguing within a certain amount of minutes. Well, can your child do that? Or are they arguing with you more than at school? Or are they cooperating more than they have been at school? I will say with our our kids with behavioral challenges, it's been kind of interesting because we're getting about half and half. Some of them are saying they're doing so much better at home, and other parents are like, I have no idea how teachers do this. So, but again, those are all sorts of ways that you can track your child and you can see what they're able to do and not do. And Taylor, I love your idea of videoing, so you can take it to the school and say, okay, we were told to read this story and this is how it went, so that they can really see.
Thank you. Those are some great ideas.
Yeah, that was a lot of really good information. So wrapping this up, are there any additional advice that you would give to parents of students with disabilities regarding educational advocacy right now?
Hang in there. Don't have a nervous breakdown. Don't tear your hair out. If you need help from somebody, call Able. Call us at Bright Horizons. We're all here. We're all able to help you and willing to help you. So keep in touch. If you have the urge to send an email at 3 a.m., it's probably not a good idea. And I would say, if you have some thoughts that you want to get out at 3 a.m., if you want to send it to somebody, send it to somebody in Taylor's office, or send it to somebody in my office and say, this is what I really wanted to get out, and this is what I really need to say to these people, and is this a good way to say it? And we can help you with that. And mind you, it's not that we don't understand how frustrated you are. Many of us are parents ourselves. We really, really get it. But when a parent sends an email that's really upset, school districts will tend to go, oh, well, there's somebody getting upset, and I'm gonna put it aside. So our job as advocates and attorneys is to help you take your perfectly valid frustration and very valid complaints and frame it in a way that's going to get you the best result. But mostly, hang in there, support each other as parents, reach out to us, reach out to agencies. We are all here to help. We may all be working from our living rooms, but we're all still here. So please don't hesitate and never feel like you're alone. Reach out on Facebook, reach out wherever you need to parent support groups and agencies and all of us.
And something I always tell parents is put things in writing, but do try to sleep on it maybe first. Don't want any nasty grams going out.
Putting things in writing is very important.
But
let somebody else read it before you hit send sometimes.
And on the flip side of that, when you do send an email that is strongly but nicely worded, if the school denies your request, ask them to put it in writing back to you, right? We're creating a paper trail. So always request, we say put things in writing, ask the school to do the same. I just want to highlight two things we already talked about, but I really like to drill down these. Remember that every special education decision is an individualized decision. There is no one-size-fits-all for students with disabilities, and parents should not accept services that are not individualized to the unique needs of their child. And the other thing is parents, again, should not agree to less than what they think their child needs. The standard for Fape, the laws have not changed due to the COVID-19 pandemic, so students should still be making progress in their learning, on their goals. So don't accept less just because of the circumstances. Yes, we're all struggling, it's a hard time, but really keep up the good fight and fight for what you think your child needs.
Excellent, thanks. Is there anything else you would like to share that has not been talked about yet?
I just want to share, Jennifer did say both of our agencies are available. We are both still open, taking applications for assistance, referrals. So please feel free to reach out, because there are going to be situations where you're not able to agree with the school about what your child needs. And the Ohio Department of Education is still open, and they have different, what they call dispute resolution options. So different mechanisms that can help parents resolve disputes. That includes mediation, facilitation of IEP meetings where a neutral party attends and tries to help the two sides communicate. And then there's state complaints and due process complaints. So those options are still available because we know that not every dispute is going to be able to be resolved without some outside or additional help. So just keep in mind that there are things out there. If you're having a hard time, contact our agencies, or go to the Ohio Department of Education's website to see what else you may be able to do.
And both of our offices can assist with both all of that wide spectrum of options. So we're more than happy to help you. And as Taylor said, the ODE does have some excellent dispute resolution procedures. We work with those facilitators and mediators quite a bit, but there are going to be times where you do need to file either what's called a procedural complaint or a due process complaint. And all of us are happy to help you with those as well.
Great. So I think next we're going to move into the question answer portion of the webinar. We've gotten quite a few questions, so be prepared. I think maybe in the interest of time, we'll just have one of the panelists answer each of the questions. So I'll maybe let you guys volunteer,
We'll flip for them.
Yeah. Let's see. So we had a few questions that were submitted ahead of time, and I'm going to begin with those. Let me pull them up. So one person says, I'm a mother who has 3 IEPs to monitor, and it is becoming very challenging with being remote. I had some extreme challenges when they were in school. It was extreme chaos during the beginning of COVID-19. What are some suggestions in dealing with a teacher who refused to do what is needed? The remote schooling has allowed the situation to evolve into a bigger situation. So it sounds like there were some teachers that were refusing to maybe follow the IEP pre-COVID, and then now that COVID has hit and everything is chaotic, the situation has become even worse.
So what I recommend is, escalate the request. So if you are having difficulties with a particular teacher, or a teacher is not doing what you think they should be doing or what's required under the IEP, talk to the special education director for the district. You can usually find that information on the district's website. Talk to the building principal, talk to the superintendent. The school districts are still having board meetings, and so there's different levels. And so when you're having a particular issue with a particular employee, I would definitely say escalate the situation, just like asking for a supervisor or manager. You want to go up the food chain to try to get that issue resolved if it's with a specific teacher within the district.
Yep. And if that should occur and you need to have an IEP meeting to follow up, be aware that, if it's a performance issue that's related to implementing the IEP and you can get that resolved in the course of the IEP or with the help of the special education director, that's great. But if you end up in an IEP meeting and somebody invites their union representative to the IEP meeting, a union representative is not an IEP team member because they are not there in the interest of the child. A teacher has a right to a union representative, but that's during employee proceedings, not an IEP. So if you find yourself in an IEP and your teacher, Mrs. Smith, who you're upset at for not following the IEP all this time, says, well, I'm bringing my union rep, that is a completely different legal proceeding, and it's not appropriate to have a union rep at your child's IEP.
Right. If a family decides to have their child attend virtually for the entire year, what can be expected for therapy services or time with intervention specialists?
So this really depends. What's the child's individualized needs? So again, regardless of the learning environment, for the therapy sessions, the parent can still request an IEP meeting to discuss how those are going to happen. Are they going to happen virtually like the learning? Are they going to happen, virtually by video on the computer, or are they going to happen by phone, depending on what type of therapy this is? So again, it's all going to be individualized, and these are things that can be put into an IEP. But it doesn't matter that a parent chose the virtual option. If the public school is offering the virtual option, then parents of students with disabilities can choose that and still expect that the services, supports in the child's IEP will be provided. So the student can do the virtual option, but still expect to get some specialized instruction from an intervention specialist. Again, what that looks like will be up to the team based on the individualized needs of that child. So if that's by video, then that's also by video, but it really will depend on what that child needs, and the parent should work with the IEP team to figure that out, and again, get creative in figuring out the solutions.
And honestly, from a practical point of view, what I've been saying all summer is that, to me, speech is the easiest related service to do virtually. I think OT and physical therapy is something we need to look at a little more closely. I know that medical providers say, oh, you can do all of those by teleservice. I still have yet to figure out how teleservice for physical therapy works. So that would be an interesting one.
Okay. My child has been on an IEP starting in pre-kindergarten because he was nonverbal and intellectually delayed. He's going into 2nd grade, and though he's still suffering with speech, he can't read or write and struggles emotionally because his peers do not understand him. We tried masks, and he suffered severe anxiety and depression at school summer camp. What rights does my son have when it comes to masks for in-school services under his IEP in order to support his social emotional well-being?
Masks are a very tricky one because the ADA has not really addressed masks as yet. We put an article up on Facebook the other night talking about different scenarios. So basically, there isn't any such thing as an exemption to wearing a mask because people are thinking, I'll just get an exemption form. But your school still has to be able to accommodate your child if they can't wear a mask. They can't say to you, well, your child has to wear a mask or we can't serve them. They still have to help you figure out how to do it safely and how to put him in a socially distanced situation so that he's safe and staff are safe, but he's not uncomfortable. Taylor or Katie, do you want to expand on that? Because I know that masks are this whole tricky area because nobody's come out and specifically said what to do with that. And we do know it's a challenge for a lot of our kids to wear those.
Yeah, definitely. Reasonable accommodations are available under the ADA in Section 504. The issue is still, how do you accommodate that need to not wear a mask and do it following health and safety guidelines and procedures? And so, again, request that reasonable accommodation and then work with the school to figure out how you can have your child in school without a mask but still safe, and whether that's where the seating is, whether that's other types of, those clear barriers that can go around desks, different things like that. It's going to be, again, creative solutions to figuring out the answers to some of these problems.
And that's a challenging one that a lot of people have been talking about lately. At the end of the last school year, I had an ESY meeting with my local school. At that time, I asked about compensatory services, and the head of special education stated they would not be discussing anything in regards to compensatory services until next school year. As a parent in the district, we have not had any communication from the district about special education. When do they need to have a talk with me about compensatory services? I did my calculations and my child received less than half of his SDI minutes.
So as far as if the school hasn't reached out yet, I would say reach out. Many teachers, oh, are you talking, Jennifer?
Nope.
Okay, just want to make sure I wasn't talking over you.
Yep. Sorry.
Many teachers are in the classroom or preparing So I would reach out now and try to get an IEP meeting scheduled as soon as possible to discuss that. You know, IEP meetings over the summer are difficult because many teachers are not working per their contract. But now that the school year is starting again and teachers are returning or starting work, I know some schools have delayed the start for students, but teachers have already started. I would start reaching out now to try to schedule an IEP meeting to discuss the compensatory services you think your child needs.
When should IEP designated assistive devices be expected to be working? Should software compatibility and capability and coordination with the planned virtual programs be expected to work on the first day of the virtual class? That's an interesting question. We spent 2 years working to get the school to approve the assistive tech and detail its use, programs, and support on the IEP. But in the spring, we learned that they failed to ensure those programs worked within the school platforms. Thank you.
I would say, I mean, ideally, yes, that parent is absolutely correct that it should be working on day one. I don't know if that's necessarily, and I hate to use this word, but realistic, given the fact that sometimes we don't know until we're actually in the trenches and the child starts using the device. But that said, I would expect very prompt response from the IT department and your special ed coordinators about how to fix it. So maybe it's not going to per se work out of the box day one. We have kids that we're working with right now because, as Taylor said, teachers are back and they're getting trained, and a lot of them are learning more about the online things. So we're working with a lot of kids on their devices right now. So what I would say is reach out to your schools now, since a lot of them are starting later, and saying, can I have this device? Can I see how it sets up? Can I do a dry run so that I can make sure by day one things are working? And develop a friendship with whoever is doing IT for your school district. So yes, it should be working on day one. I don't know if that's realistic, but it shouldn't drag on for a long time either, because then that gets into the school's legal responsibility to accommodate your child. So
and this is another very interesting question. My son is 21 and has 1 year left of services. Is it possible to push for another year?
So the IDEA, the way the law is written, it's through age 21, and the requirements end at age 22. So generally that's the way the federal law is written. I would say there is an exception to this, and well, I would call it an exception for compensatory education services. So your child needs compensatory education and has turned 22, they could still get that past that 22nd birthday. So that is one way to try to get services for them past that age cutoff that's in the law.
Okay. In my child's IEP, we had removed educational goals for a work goal, but I don't want my child to go into a work environment right now, and my son wants to continue to learn. Am I able to put my educational goals back in?
yeah, absolutely. You can modify an IEP at any time. Nobody can say to you, well, you signed this last year, it's frozen in stone, you can't touch it. Because you have a reasonable reason to be moving on to or not wanting to go into a work setting right now. So you can say, I'd still like to work, and I don't know your child, but I'm just guessing. You can say, I'd still like to work on some more basic reading and basic math skills. But that said, because I have had some kids do this with summer work experience, you might look at what things from the work goal can be taken over into the virtual environment. So like if there was interviewing practice, can you still do that? If there's following a task from a supervisor, if there's starting out your work sessions independently, what pieces of the work goal can you still be working on, as opposed to, well, I'm just not feeling comfortable with my child going into a work setting right now. So I would say keep the work goal, tweak it, and then if there are academic areas that you think your child can work on that they'd still benefit from, ask about putting those back in.
My son is on an IEP and is entering 9th grade. I decided to send him back to school because he did not do well with virtual classes, and I ended up doing his work. I just found out that the teacher will be changing classes to teach math. I wonder how to address that, because the teacher will be exposed to other students in school and then come back to his classroom. So then he could come back and possibly expose the special needs kids. So it sounds like the student is in a self-contained classroom, and the special ed teacher will be switching back and forth between a general ed math and a self-contained classroom, and the parent is concerned about exposure to COVID. Is there anything that she would be able to do?
I'm just thinking, as I think about it, that's an interesting one where I would follow up with the special ed director, because what we're hearing from special ed directors, and again, it changes almost by the day, but the kids in self-contained, they're really trying to keep self-contained, and those are the ones that they're feeling best about keeping safe, bringing back to school. So I'm not sure how that goes with the teacher moving back and forth. So I would say follow up with your special ed director about how that's actually working. And then Taylor, do you have anything to add? Just because that seems strange to me that we'd be keeping the kids self-contained, but the teacher is moving, because you're still, if the parent raises a valid question about the exposure there.
Yeah, I would, talk to the special ed director or even the superintendent, because this is a more of a, it obviously applies for this child, but it is part of the broader health and safety guidelines that have been issued for schools, and how they're supposed to be distancing, and how they're supposed to be, keeping cohorts or a track of groups that have interaction with each other. So there's all these guidelines that have to be followed, and I would follow up to see what safety precautions are being taken when that teacher goes into the other classroom. Are they always behind one of the barriers? In a self-contained classroom, I would doubt that is happening, so they probably have a little bit closer interaction with some of their students. So I would definitely just follow up and see what precautions are being taken if that teacher is going to be in multiple classrooms within one day. Because I think the objective overall for schools is to limit that transfer of teachers and students.
This is related to the question that was just asked, so I'm going to ask this one next. How do we include goals in the IEP related to COVID protection and support?
I don't know that it would be a goal as much as an accommodation. There might, because a goal is a specific thing that your child needs to work on, a skill that your child needs to develop. So there might be something in as much as teaching your child how to social distance, but I think of it more as what accommodations does your child need? Like, for example, if they can't do a mask, can they do a plastic face shield? If they can't do either one, how can we rearrange the classroom for better safety and things like that? So I think of it as more an accommodation than per se your child's goal. But I think as we're unfortunately all living in a COVID world right now, certainly if your child has issues with personal space and understanding that, then, and that might typically be an IEP goal for school, I think it's all the more important that we continue to talk about those things in the age of COVID. So
yeah, I think some of it may be how it's framed. Like Jennifer said, if your child was already having difficulties with maintaining personal space, that can be an IEP goal. It can be, understanding hygiene and that type of thing, and really, so it really could depend on how that would be framed, whether it's a goal or whether it's just a service instruction on those different areas. So that it can be put into the IEP in several different areas, but it could be a creative way of phrasing it to make sure that your child is able to work on that at school.
All right. We got a question, what type of documentation should a parent be keeping in relation to their child's IEP goals when they're in a virtual environment? And I know, Taylor, you touched on this a little bit, but is there anything additional that you would want to share with everybody?
Yeah, I would just say, make sure you're looking at what the IEP goal is and that you have progress reports, grade cards, other, school records, whether it's work completed, so you know where your child was before the building closure, at the end of it, going into this new school year. And really, well, what the tracking looks like likely depends on what the goal is. If it's a behavior goal, tracking that's going to look a little bit different than tracking the writing goal I talked about. And, really it's going to be what works for you as a parent, what makes sense for you as a parent. Does it make sense for you to keep a chart? And are you able to observe their behavior throughout their whole, virtual learning time? Or are you not? So it's going to really depend on what works for the parent as far as what is going to be tracked and what can be tracked, and depend on what the student is working on. But make sure you have the baseline and you know what your student is supposed to be working on.
Yeah, and if you look at the wording, and we all are supposed to be working on good IEP wording, but as Taylor said at the beginning, we're all into acronyms and jargon. If you're looking at something on your IEP that says your child will do something 80% of the time on 3 out of 4 trials given, yada, yada, and you're thinking, just forget all those extra words and just think 3 out of 4 times that you ask your child to do this, can they do it? So forget all that lingo and just think in terms of, can they do it 2 out of 3 times? Can they do it 3 out of 4?
All right. How can a parent address delays in getting an evaluation when the school is only providing virtual services? And that's an interesting question.
So the deadlines for evaluations have not been waived, just like the rest of the IDEA has not been waived. The deadlines for evaluations have not been waived. That being said, the Ohio Department of Education has given guidance about face-to-face evaluations and the challenges of doing an evaluation that requires a face-to-face evaluation. So there's a couple of different ways parents could handle this. First, I would, parents can make sure they request, if the school's agreed to the evaluation, they should still be doing as much of the evaluation virtually as they can. Now that school buildings are no longer closed, some of those face-to-face evaluations may be possible, and the new guidance says as long as it can be done in a healthy and safe manner following those guidelines. So it is possible to do those face-to-face evaluations now. If you don't feel comfortable with having to face-to-face and you think it's necessary, do the rest of the evaluation, get the rest of the things in place, and then you can go back and do that. And definitely, for the time missed, think about whether your child needs compensatory education because the evaluation wasn't done, they didn't have the IEP, they weren't getting the services, and thus not getting Fape. So it's going to be a challenge, especially for evaluations that have a component that's difficult to do virtually. But schools are still supposed to be following those deadlines set by the law.
Yeah, so if anybody if anybody didn't get their psychological testing done because it was supposed to happen right during the COVID shutdown, that was during the spring, but as Taylor said, those restrictions are off now. So you should be going back to your district and your school psychologist and say, hey, I know you're back now. I understand you couldn't legally do it in the spring, but how can we get this started as quickly as possible now?
All right, so we are coming to the end of the questions. We just have a few more. This is, I think, been a really good question and answer session, and it's interesting to see where everybody's minds are right now. Let's see, can Can a parent decline the IAT process when in a virtual learning environment?
I don't know that I ever would, because the IAT process is designed to help see if your child does need more supports and services. So I would say, if your school district is coming to you and saying, we think your child needs more help, which I'm waiting to see if Taylor's chuckling, because in our line of work it doesn't usually happen that way. I would say, go for any support that your school is offering you, unless I'm misunderstanding the question about IAT.
Yeah, the only I guess caveat I have to that is, so when we're talking about IAT or IRT or RIT, whatever your school calls it, they should not be using that process to delay an evaluation. So if you feel like
absolutely
requesting an evaluation and they're just using this to delay doing the actual evaluation, that may be a time where you say, no, I want an actual evaluation. I don't just want this process. But otherwise, if the school, is just coming to you saying, hey, we think your child may need some extra help, because, this is what we're going to do, that can be good, but they cannot use it, that process to delay an evaluation.
Yeah, thank you, Taylor. I wasn't thinking about that, and you're absolutely right. It should never, ever be used to delay testing. They can do them both concurrently.
As some schools are open face-to-face and parents were given the option to enroll in online virtual academy that is separate from the school district, I'm curious if there are still required accommodations for students on an IEP in the online virtual academy. And if there are, who is responsible for providing the district or the academy?
If your school district is contracting with like a private service like K-12 to provide your accommodations, it may be K-12 that's responsible for actually providing them, but your school district, because they selected them as a contractor, your school district is still ultimately liable for following up with the IEP. So if your school district shows some sort of private provider and the private provider says, oh, we don't do that, then it needs to go back to your school district and you need to say, hey, the provider you chose doesn't understand that the ADA and 504 are still here. At least that's how I understand that question. Anything that your school district is saying, this is our online option, at the end of the day, they're ultimately responsible because they're handing you this online option.
And two more questions. Should denials by the school be written as a PR01?
Yes. Anytime you make a request for something and the school denies it, they should put it in the PR01. It's a prior written notice, so it's a form the Ohio Department of Education provides. And so whenever you have a meeting where decisions are made, actually, you should get a PR01. And you should get a PR01 before some meetings. So, as we talked about, everything that you do should be in writing, but the things the school does should also be in writing. And sometimes what we've found is that those PR01s don't always accurately reflect what was discussed or what happened in an IEP meeting. And sometimes we aren't able to get the school to change that. So we will write a letter or something back saying, this is what happened from our perspective at this meeting. This is what we requested, and this is what the school said. Because really what you're both doing is just creating records. But anything, if the school denies anything, whether it's adding a service to the IEP or recovery services or ESY, they should put it in the PR01 and state the discussion and why that decision was made.
And then the last parent question is, speaking of the 3/4 trial language and IEP goals, how often is this done within the timeline of the IEP? 4 times throughout the school year or 4 times per progress reporting? Last year, we saw the intervention specialist only trial once a quarter.
Ugh. Okay, that's a whole other set of issues, but really it should be on. I tend to like 3 out of 4 occurrences, and I guess as an advocate I would be assuming if we're looking at an academic thing, we're looking at either 3 out of 4 times, and that's happening several times during a week. I mean, it kind of depends on what the goal is, but it should never be like, oh, look, we did it once a quarter and they did it 3 out of 4. If the measuring in your progress reports has been that limited, I think you have a bigger problem than this question, because 3 out of 4 times should really be like during the math lesson or during the week, or like if you're doing a certain type of math problems, 3 out of the 4 math problems they can do. So there should be a fairly high degree of frequency there. Taylor, do you want to add?
Yes, I agree. I mean, it does depend kind of on what the goal is, but I mean, especially when you're talking about behavior goals, I mean, we see that, you know, it's almost daily. Many times it is daily that it's being tracked, how the behavior is throughout the day, not just, you know, 4 random days within any quarter, on which, you know, the progress reports may be every quarter, but the measurement of the goals and the progress, and that should definitely be happening far more often than once a quarter, or even just 4 times a quarter.
So that was all of our parent questions. I guess just kind of wrapping everything up, it sounds like most people are concerned about, you know, their kids either A, being able to receive Fape virtually, or B, being able to stay safe in the school environment. And then C, if those 2 things and the chaos of everything that's happening right now don't work, being able to receive compensatory services in the future if Fape isn't accomplished. I mean, do you guys have any last advice? Those are pretty comprehensive issues, but you know, a sentence or 2, what should parents be focused on right now in ensuring that their children are receiving the educational services they need, or potentially petitioning for compensatory services?
I guess my parting thoughts are, you know, don't wait for the school to come to you to fix the problems. You go to the school, and if you can think of creative solutions, bring those ideas to the IEP team. Don't wait for the school to try to fix it or have all the ideas to fix it, because you know your student best, you know your child best, and so you likely have the best ideas about what's going to work for them. And you know, just keep being a zealous advocate for them.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And as we said at the beginning and throughout, you offer those suggestions, but then you can go to the school and say, I can see this really isn't working for my child, but I don't know what to do. We need to, in this time, we really need to emphasize everybody putting their heads together and being really creative. So it's okay to go to a school and say, I can't do this. I don't know what to do. I need your help. Or to say, I know you have it this way, but it works better for my child this way. So can we do this instead? It's really a huge time where you need to be willing to speak to the school and let them know what you're seeing and what's working and what's not working, because we can't help you and the schools can't help you if they don't know what's going on. And the default is going to be from a school district perspective, and I'm not downing the schools, but if they don't hear from you, they're going to assume everything is okay and everything's working. So don't go through weeks and weeks of your child being frustrated. And for heaven's sakes, don't do all your child's homework and get it turned in, because that's going to, the school is going to think everything is hunky-dory. So if you're doing more work than your child is, please get a hold of the school. Please get a hold of somebody at ABLE or somebody at our office or another advocate and say, I need some help here.
Those are great pieces of advice. Thank you so much for sharing that. As we come to an end, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this morning, as well as Jennifer and Taylor. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer some of our questions. I know I definitely learned a lot today. Again, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day. Thank you again to everyone who's participating, and enjoy. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.